They had not seen her for years, not since the stepmother's wishes had been granted and she was forced out of the home she once believed was hers. Rumors had spread. Some said she had vanished into nothingness, others claimed she would never return, and a few insisted she had been broken beyond repair. That was why, on that day when the doors opened and she stepped inside, the crowd fell into silence. No one expected the smile. It wasn't the small, timid curve of lips from the child they remembered. It was radiant, assured, and almost disarming. Her smile wasn't just happiness, it was defiance, triumph, and the kind of grace that carried the weight of all the battles she had endured. It was the smile that shook them because it carried the unspoken message. She had survived, she had risen, and nothing could reduce her anymore. But for them to understand the force of that smile, they had to remember the shadows she had walked through. Behind it was a story that began with cruelty disguised as care. The stepmother, adorned with charm and sweet words for outsiders, had harbored a bitterness that turned inward toward the girl. It wasn't immediate, the way she set out to erase her. At first it was subtle, the quiet removal of affection, the replacement of warmth with cold stares, the dismissal of her needs as if they were inconveniences. Then as time passed, the cruelty sharpened. Words designed to pierce, decisions crafted to exclude, punishments given without cause. The girl's presence became an irritation, her joy an offense, her very existence a threat to the stepmother's fragile sense of control. The smile they now saw on her face was the very thing the stepmother had tried to erase. The stepmother had wanted her silence, her invisibility, her disappearance. She had wanted to drive her so far away that her memory would fade into whispers. Instead, she had returned brighter, stronger, carrying in her smile the resilience of someone who had been pushed to the edges of despair and yet found the courage to pull herself back. That was why the room seemed to hold its breath. They remembered the whispered stories of her departure, the way the stepmother had pretended sorrow while secretly satisfied, the way she had dismissed the child as unworthy of belonging. Now, in her return, the girl did not raise her voice, she did not accuse, she did not point fingers. She only smiled. And that was enough. That smile revealed 1,000 truths at once. Betrayal had not defeated her, rejection had not destroyed her, and time had not stolen her spirit. This is the story of that transformation. The journey from rejection to redemption, from being unwanted to becoming unforgettable. It is a tale that does not begin with victory but with pain, that does not rise without first falling, that does not shine without first enduring darkness. It is a story of a stepmother who wanted her gone, of cruelty that sought to erase her existence, and of the resilience that refused to be silenced. Above all, it is a story of how one girl came back with nothing more than a smile, and yet that smile held the power to shake everyone who saw it. The girl's life had not always been drenched in shadows. In the earliest years before the stepmother appeared, she knew what happiness meant in its purest form. She remembered laughter echoing in the hallways, warm embraces at night, and mornings where the sunlight felt like a promise of safety. Her father was her anchor, a man who would lift her into the air and tell her she was his world. Those moments, fleeting as they were, created the foundation of her hope. It was that memory of love, small and precious, that would one day keep her from crumbling completely. But life rarely allows innocence to remain untouched. Her father, once the center of her joy, began to fade, not from her heart but from her daily existence. Whether through work, distraction, or weakness, he was often absent, leaving a space that longed for affection and left her vulnerable to the new presence that would soon claim authority. When the stepmother entered, she did not storm in like a villain out of a storybook. Instead, she smiled, charmed, and cloaked her true nature in sweetness. To outsiders, she seemed perfect, elegant, graceful, even generous. To the father, she was a savior, someone who promised companionship and stability. But for the girl, she was the slow undoing of everything she had ever known. At first, the differences were small. A cold glance when no one else was looking. A toy quietly taken away. A request ignored. The girl would turn to her father for reassurance, but he dismissed her complaints with a distracted laugh, unable or unwilling to see what was unfolding. And so the stepmother's shadow grew bolder. The cruelty was subtle, refined, almost artful. She never struck in ways that could be easily exposed. Instead, she erased her stepdaughter piece by piece. She would lavish attention on others in the girl's presence, reminding her with every gesture that she was unworthy. She would whisper words designed to linger like poison. You don't belong, no one cares for you, you are a burden. Sometimes, it was not even words but silence. Silence that cut deeper than any insult, silence that told her she was invisible. What made it worse was the world's blindness. To neighbors, relatives, even the father, the stepmother was the picture of kindness. She painted herself as the martyr, the one who endured, the one who sacrificed. And the girl, too young to defend herself, was seen as ungrateful when she cried. Loneliness became her daily companion. She learned to hold back her tears, for no one would comfort her. She learned to eat quickly and quietly, lest she be scolded for taking too long. She learned to keep her joys secret, for whenever she smiled too brightly, it seemed to provoke her stepmother's anger. Yet even in those years of neglect, a small flame of hope flickered inside her. The warmth of her father's early love lingered in her memory. The innocence of her childhood had been fractured, but not completely destroyed. It was that fragile hope that whispered to her that life was not always going to be this way, that one day she might rise above the coldness pressing down on her. But as the stepmother's reign deepened, that hope grew harder to hold. What once had been small cruelties now grew sharper, more deliberate, and more isolating. And the girl, though still young, began to understand that she was unwanted in her own home, an intruder in the life she should have belonged to. The seed of her exile was already planted, and though she did not yet know it, it was only a matter of time before the stepmother found a way to make her disappear entirely. The stepmother's dominance over the house did not happen overnight. It was slow, deliberate, like a creeping frost that took hold of every corner until warmth itself seemed like a memory. By the time the girl was old enough to understand what was happening, the walls that once sheltered her had become a cage designed to keep her small. The stepmother knew how to mask her cruelty with refinement, how to twist every moment to her advantage while maintaining the appearance of dignity. To the outside world, she was the ideal wife, the perfect hostess, the woman who held everything together. But behind closed doors, her reign was absolute, and it thrived on the suffering of one innocent child. The acts of cruelty came in many forms, some so small they seemed almost invisible to those who weren't looking closely. A missing meal here, a withheld blanket there, deliberate exclusions from family outings, sudden punishments without reason. Each act was meant to chip away at the girl's spirit, to remind her that she was unwelcome, that she was nothing more than an inconvenience. The stepmother favored sharp contrasts, lavishing praise on others in public, then reducing the girl to silence in private. If the girl received a compliment from a neighbor, the stepmother would later find fault with everything she did, as though joy itself was a crime. Worse still were the psychological games. The stepmother mastered the art of gaslighting, twisting the girl's words until even she doubted her own memory. That never happened, the stepmother would insist after some act of cruelty. You must have imagined it. When the girl tried to confide in her father, the stepmother would interject sweetly, turning his doubts against his daughter. She's been so sensitive lately. Maybe she needs discipline, not attention. And the father, weary and easily convinced, began to withdraw further, leaving the girl exposed to manipulation with no shield. Each failed attempt to seek help only confirmed what the stepmother wanted her to believe, that she was alone, that no one would come to save her. Isolation was one of the stepmother's most powerful weapons. She orchestrated it carefully, ensuring the girl had little contact with friends or relatives who might notice her pain. Invitations to gatherings mysteriously never reached her. Letters were lost, gifts misplaced, opportunities snatched away. The house became both a prison and a theater, where the stepmother played her dual roles, the doting caregiver for the world, the merciless tyrant for the girl. Slowly, the child began to fold into herself, retreating into quiet corners, shrinking her presence so as not to provoke wrath. Yet no matter how small she tried to make herself, the stepmother always found reasons to strike. The cruelty was not only direct but also comparative. The stepmother often held up others as mirrors to remind her stepdaughter of her supposed inadequacy. "Why can't you be more like them?" she would ask, each word sharpened with disdain. The girl's achievements, when they existed, were dismissed as luck, while her mistakes were magnified into proof of her worthlessness. Every effort to please was met with moving goalposts, every attempt at obedience rewarded with new demands. The game was designed so she could never win, so that defeat became her constant companion. And yet, beneath the stepmother's cruelty there was fear. Though she tried to disguise it with arrogance, what truly drove her was jealousy. The girl possessed something she could never manufacture, a natural light, an innocence, a smile that radiated from within. It was the kind of light that drew people, that made them want to protect and cherish her. The stepmother could see it, even if others overlooked it, and it infuriated her. For no matter how much she tried to stamp it out, the glow refused to vanish entirely. That stubborn spark threatened everything the stepmother wanted: control, admiration, and dominance. To extinguish it became her mission. The community, blind to the truth, admired the stepmother endlessly. Neighbors praised her elegance, friends marveled at her hospitality. They saw the neatly maintained home, the polite smiles, the carefully curated life. And when they did see the girl, quiet and withdrawn, they nodded knowingly, convinced by the stepmother's narrative that she was simply troubled, difficult, ungrateful. The more the stepmother cultivated her image, the more isolated the girl became. Even her father, who should have been her protector, failed to see the truth. He was caught in the web of the stepmother's charm, too weary to question her intentions, too blind to notice his daughter's fading light. For the girl, these years were the hardest. Each day blended into the next, a cycle of silence, punishment, and longing. She questioned her worth, doubted her own memories, wondered if perhaps the stepmother was right and she truly was unworthy of love. Yet somewhere deep inside, a small voice resisted. It whispered that this cruelty was not truth, that love once existed and could exist again, that life beyond those walls might hold something different. The stepmother ruled her world with iron cunning, but she could not completely crush the seed of resilience buried within her. And though the girl could not yet see it, that seed would one day grow strong enough to shatter the empire of cruelty her stepmother had built. It happened gradually, though in memory it feels like a single blow that split her life in two. There had always been whispers of abandonment in the way her stepmother's eyes lingered on her, a threat unspoken but ever present. Yet the moment it became reality was sharper, crueler, more final than anything she had endured before. The breaking point was not a sudden act of violence but a carefully orchestrated betrayal, the kind that left scars not on the body but on the soul. She had known hunger, she had known silence, she had known the cold weight of being unwanted, but she had not known the depth of despair until the day she realized she was no longer welcome in the house that once held her laughter. The moment itself came wrapped in deception. The stepmother had prepared the ground well, planting seeds of doubt in her father's mind, painting the girl as rebellious, ungrateful, even dangerous to the peace of the household. She staged scenes where the girl seemed at fault, twisted half-truths into full accusations, and wore an expression of patient suffering whenever her husband glanced her way. By the time the confrontation came, the father was no longer a man torn between two loves. He had been convinced that one of them was poison. When he told her she had to leave, his words stumbled, heavy with guilt, but the decision was already sealed. The girl looked at him, searching for the father who had once lifted her high above his shoulders, who had promised she would always be safe with him. But he would not meet her eyes. She packed what little she was allowed to take. A small bundle of clothes, a single trinket from her childhood, and the weight of rejection pressing down on her shoulders. The house around her felt unfamiliar now, stripped of any warmth it had once held. Every wall seemed to echo with the stepmother's victory, every silence a confirmation that she was no longer wanted. When she stepped outside, the door closing behind her, she felt as though she had been erased, not just from her home but from the very fabric of belonging itself. At first there was only numbness. She walked without direction, her feet carrying her away from everything she had known. But as the hours turned into days, the numbness gave way to pain. It was a raw, gnawing ache that lived in her chest, the ache of being discarded by the very people who should have protected her. Loneliness became a physical presence, pressing down on her in every empty night, in every quiet dawn. She whispered to herself just to hear a voice, because the silence was too loud, too heavy, too unbearable. She questioned herself endlessly. Had she done something to deserve it? Had she truly been unlovable, as the stepmother insisted? Were her father's fading affections proof that she had failed as a daughter? These questions gnawed at her, each one sharper than the last, until despair became a constant shadow. And yet, in the darkest moments, when the weight threatened to crush her completely, there was still a flicker of resistance. It came in memories of small joys, her father's laugh before it was stolen, the warmth of a blanket tucked around her when she was very young, the feeling of sunlight on her face when she still believed she belonged. Those memories were not enough to heal her, but they were enough to keep her from collapsing entirely. The breaking point, though cruel, was also a beginning. Stripped of the illusion of safety, forced out of the place that had been both home and prison, she found herself facing the world alone. It was terrifying, yes, but within that terror lay possibility. The stepmother had intended her exile to be the end, the final erasure of a girl she had deemed unnecessary. But what she could not have known was that rejection, though it left wounds, also planted seeds. The girl would learn to survive, to endure, to discover strength she had never been allowed to see in herself. The pain of betrayal would not vanish, but in time, it would transform into something else, a determination not to be defined by the cruelty of others. On that first night away, under a sky indifferent to her suffering, she cried until her body ached. And then, when there were no more tears left, she made a quiet vow to herself. She did not yet know how, she did not yet know when, but she would rise. She would not let the stepmother's wish become the final truth of her existence. Though she did not yet understand the power she carried, though she could not yet imagine the smile that would one day return, she had taken the first fragile step toward becoming someone unbreakable. In the beginning, survival was the only goal. She had been cast out with nothing but a small bundle and a heart heavy with rejection, and the world did not open its arms in welcome. The days that followed her exile were filled with uncertainty: where to sleep, what to eat, how to make herself invisible when danger lurked too close. Yet even in those fragile moments she began to discover that her spirit, though battered, was not broken. Every step she took away from the house that had rejected her was also a step toward herself, toward a life that would eventually be hers alone. The transformation did not arrive like a lightning strike. It was slow, painful, and forged through trial and persistence. But in its unfolding, she became more than the discarded girl her stepmother wanted her to be. At first, her survival depended on the kindness of strangers and the resilience she didn't yet realize she carried. A kind woman in a nearby town offered her bread when she saw the hunger in her eyes. A weary old man, rough in manner but generous in heart, let her rest in the corner of his barn for a few nights. Each act of mercy reminded her that the world was not entirely cruel, that not everyone saw her as disposable. It was during these moments that she learned to accept help without shame, to recognize that strength sometimes meant allowing others to carry part of the burden. Slowly, she began to find her footing, piecing together the fragments of her existence into something resembling a life. Work became her anchor. She sought out small tasks: sweeping floors, carrying water, tending animals, anything that would earn her a coin or a meal. The work was hard, often thankless, but it gave her something the stepmother had tried to steal: a sense of worth. For every day she labored, she proved to herself that she could endure. The exhaustion of her body was nothing compared to the exhaustion of the soul she had known in her stepmother's house. Here, at least, her effort meant something. And with every coin she earned, with every bit of food she secured, she felt the smallest flicker of independence. As time passed, the people around her began to notice her quiet determination. Though she was reserved, there was a light in her that caught attention, the same light that had once sparked the stepmother's jealousy. An elderly teacher who saw her sweeping the steps of his school one evening paused to watch her. Something about the way she carried herself, the stubbornness in her eyes despite her ragged clothes, stirred him. He asked her name, her story, and though she hesitated, she told him a version of it, enough for him to understand that she had been cast aside. Instead of pity, he offered opportunity. He allowed her to sit in on his lessons, to learn letters and numbers when her chores were done. Education opened doors she had never dared to imagine. Words became her companions, knowledge her weapon. She read late into the night when candles burned low, copying sentences until her hands cramped, determined to grasp every scrap of learning she could. For the first time, she felt her mind expand beyond survival into curiosity, into ambition. She began to see a future that stretched farther than the horizon of her pain. Each book she read, each lesson she absorbed, built her into someone new, not the discarded child of a stepmother's cruelty, but a young woman with possibilities. But the transformation was not only external, it was deeply internal. She had to face the wounds she carried, the voices of doubt that whispered she was unworthy. There were nights when memories of her stepmother's words echoed in her head, louder than any silence, threatening to undo her progress. On those nights she wept, but she did not stop. She began to understand that healing did not mean forgetting. It meant refusing to let the cruelty define her. Slowly, she learned to silence the voice that told her she was unwanted and replace it with one that said she was strong. She also found companions who, unlike her stepmother, saw her not as a burden but as someone worth standing beside. The kind woman who had first fed her continued to check in, offering small comforts. The old teacher became not only a mentor but a source of encouragement, reminding her that knowledge could be a shield as well as a key. Others drifted into her life too: a fellow worker who shared laughter after long days, a neighbor who taught her practical skills, a stranger who spoke words of hope when she most needed to hear them. Piece by piece, these connections stitched together a new kind of family, one chosen rather than forced. As she grew older, her transformation became visible not only to herself but to those around her. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that was impossible to ignore. She worked harder than most, studied with more passion than many, and never stopped believing, however faintly, that she was meant for more than the smallness her stepmother had tried to impose. The resilience she cultivated became her armor, and the kindness she received as well as the kindness she chose to give in return became her sword. Most importantly, she rediscovered her smile. It had been absent for so long, hidden under fear and sadness, that when it returned, it startled even her. It came not in a moment of triumph but in something simple, a child she had helped learn to read beaming up at her with pride. The joy she felt in that instant cracked through the layers of sorrow, and before she realized it she was smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in years. That smile, fragile at first, grew stronger as she healed. It was no longer the smile of a naive child but the smile of someone who had endured, survived, and risen. By the time she was ready to return, she was no longer the girl who had been cast out. She had built herself from the ashes of rejection, shaped her identity from resilience, and carved her path with determination. She was educated, independent, and stronger than her stepmother could have ever imagined. And though the scars of her past would always remain, they no longer defined her. What defined her now was the light she carried, the smile that would one day shake the world that once sought to erase her. The return was not planned as a grand performance. She did not set out with the intention of making the world watch her triumph or of humiliating the woman who had once cast her aside. In truth, her return began as something simple, a pull toward the place where her story had started, a quiet need to face the shadows of her past. Yet fate has a way of transforming even the quietest steps into thunder when they are taken by someone who has endured and risen. By the time she walked back through those familiar streets, carrying herself with a grace born of survival, her presence alone became an event. People stopped to stare, whispers rippled through the crowd, and anticipation filled the air. The discarded child had come home and she was no longer a child. Her appearance had changed, but it was not her clothing or posture that drew attention. It was the aura she carried, the calm assurance in her movements, the way her eyes no longer darted nervously but met the world directly. And most of all, it was the smile on her face. It was not boastful or mocking, it was serene, radiant, the smile of someone who had walked through fire and emerged whole. Those who remembered her as the quiet, diminished girl blinked in disbelief, struggling to reconcile their memory with the woman before them. It was as though time itself had reshaped her into something unrecognizable and yet unmistakable. The stepmother, upon hearing of her return, reacted first with disbelief. She had been certain her work was complete, that the girl had vanished into the abyss where the forgotten belong. For years she had told herself the exile was permanent, that she had succeeded in erasing the one presence that threatened her control. But now to hear that she had come back, not broken, not begging but smiling, was like ice sliding down her spine. Anger flared quickly after the shock. She rehearsed excuses in her mind, prepared to weave lies to the community if needed. Yet beneath the anger was fear, the kind of fear only born from guilt. She knew the truth of what she had done, and seeing her stepdaughter alive and unbowed meant that truth could no longer remain buried. The reunion itself was charged with silence. When the two women stood face to face, the air between them seemed to crackle. The stepmother's face was a mask of forced composure, but her eyes betrayed her, narrow, sharp, desperate to maintain control. The girl, now a woman, offered no accusations, no raised voice, no dramatic unveiling of the years of cruelty. She simply smiled. That smile, calm and unwavering, was louder than any accusation could ever be. It told the stepmother that her attempts to destroy had failed, that the scars she inflicted had only forged strength. The smile exposed her as powerless, because nothing unsettles a tyrant more than the resilience of their victim. The community, gathered as though instinctively drawn to the moment, watched in stunned silence. They remembered the girl as quiet, awkward, always in the stepmother's shadow. They had believed the stepmother's crafted stories, nodding along when she sighed about her difficult child, pitying her for her supposed burden. Now they saw the lie unravel. The woman who returned carried no bitterness in her expression, no desperation for approval. She carried only grace and dignity, and in that dignity the stepmother's falsehoods crumbled. People who had once ignored her began to murmur, shame flickering in their eyes as they realized their complicity in her erasure. The stepmother, once adored for her charm, suddenly appeared small in comparison. The father, too, was confronted by her return. His guilt, long buried under layers of excuses and denial, surged to the surface the moment he saw her. She was no longer the little girl who had clung to his hand, but her presence stirred memories he had worked hard to silence. Her smile toward him was softer, tinged with sadness but not bitterness. It was not a smile of forgiveness, not yet, but one that said she had survived without him, that his failure to protect her had not defined her. That truth stung deeper than any accusation could. The power shift was undeniable. The stepmother, once the commanding presence, found herself shrinking, her carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of her stepdaughter's calm. The woman she had cast out did not need to raise her voice to reclaim her place. Her very existence, her unbroken spirit, was enough. The smile was her weapon and her shield, radiating a strength that no cruelty could diminish. Her return also stirred admiration. Younger girls watched her with wide eyes, inspired by her resilience. Mothers whispered to one another, marveling at her strength, recognizing the injustice they had failed to challenge years before. The story of her exile, once a murmur, began to spread anew, but now retold through the lens of her victory. She had returned not as the forgotten girl but as a symbol, a living reminder that survival can bloom into triumph. The stepmother's world began to unravel that day. Every attempt to dismiss her return, every sneer or cold remark, only revealed her insecurity. People who once admired her began to pull away, unsettled by the contrast between her bitterness and her stepdaughter's quiet strength. The mask of perfection she had worn for so long no longer convinced anyone. Against the brightness of the woman who had returned, her cruelty was finally exposed. Yet the woman who had been cast out did not linger in vengeance. Her return was not about revenge, it was about reclaiming her story. She walked through the streets with her head high, greeting those who had ignored her before, not with bitterness but with dignity. Her presence alone was enough to unsettle the guilty and inspire the silent. And through it all, her smile remained, steady, unwavering, a beacon of the journey she had endured. The moment the smile revealed its full power was not in a loud declaration or a dramatic confrontation but in silence. An unshakable, steady silence that demanded attention. People who had gathered to watch her return found themselves unable to look away. It was not simply a smile of happiness, it was something larger, something that unsettled, inspired, and captivated all at once. It was the smile of someone who had walked through betrayal, endured loneliness, and survived abandonment, and yet had chosen not to let bitterness consume her. It was the kind of smile that carried within it a story too heavy for words, a smile that forced those who saw it to confront their own guilt, their own blindness, their own complicity. For years, the stepmother had been the author of the narrative, convincing everyone that the girl was difficult, ungrateful, undeserving of love. The community had accepted that story because it was easier than questioning it. But now, with one simple smile, the truth shattered their illusions. The woman who stood before them radiated strength, dignity, and light, none of the traits the stepmother had painted. The contrast was too stark to ignore. Whispers rose quickly, questions stirring. How had they been so blind? How had they not seen the cruelty? How had they allowed themselves to be deceived? The smile demanded those questions even without her speaking a word. For the stepmother, the smile was unbearable. Every attempt to diminish her stepdaughter had been designed to extinguish that very light. She had believed that exile would silence her forever, that the girl would never have the chance to return. Yet here she was, standing tall, smiling with a strength that made every act of cruelty look pitiful by comparison. The stepmother's lips tightened, her composure faltering as she realized that she could not control the narrative anymore. Her power, built on manipulation and deception, crumbled under the weight of that unbroken spirit. It was not anger or revenge that undid her, but grace, the grace of a smile that said, "I am still here and you cannot erase me." For the father, the smile struck deeper than any words could have. It carried both love and sorrow, forgiveness and distance. It reminded him of the little girl he had once known, the daughter who had looked at him with adoration before his silence betrayed her. It also revealed to him that she no longer needed him. She had grown beyond his protection, beyond his weakness, into someone far stronger than he had ever been. That realization broke something inside him, a grief sharper than anger, because he understood too late that he had forfeited his place in her triumph. The community responded in awe. Some felt shame for the years they had believed lies, others felt admiration for the resilience they now saw. Mothers nudged their daughters, pointing to her as an example of courage, of survival, of the refusal to be broken. Young girls watched her closely, seeing in her not just a survivor but a symbol of hope, that no matter how dark the world might seem, it was possible to rise above it. The smile became more than an expression. It became a statement, a lesson, a living proof that resilience is the greatest form of defiance. What made the smile unforgettable was its duality. It was both gentle and powerful, kind yet unyielding. It forgave without forgetting, it triumphed without arrogance. It did not deny the pain of the past but declared that the past had not won. It was a smile that unsettled the cruel, humbled the blind, and inspired the weary. It was a smile that turned the tables not through force but through presence, not through vengeance but through survival. The stepmother tried to recover her image, tried to dismiss the moment with mocking words or feigned indifference, but nothing she said could overpower what everyone had already seen. The more she sneered, the more hollow she appeared. Against the backdrop of that radiant smile, her bitterness looked small, her lies transparent. In that moment she lost the power she had clung to for so long, and she knew it. The woman herself felt no need to gloat. She did not smile to humiliate or to boast. She smiled because she had won something greater than revenge. She had won herself back. That smile was her declaration of independence, her refusal to let cruelty define her. It was the culmination of every hardship endured, every tear shed, every night spent alone wondering if she was worth anything at all. It was the smile of a survivor, a warrior, a woman who had transformed pain into power. And when she turned to walk away, the smile lingered in their minds. People carried it with them long after she was gone, whispering about it to neighbors, remembering it in quiet moments. It shook them because it was unforgettable, because it forced them to reckon with the truth, because it revealed that light cannot be extinguished by cruelty. The stepmother had wanted her gone, erased, forgotten. Instead, she returned with a smile that would be remembered long after the stepmother's name was lost to bitterness. In the days that followed, the echo of her return lingered like a quiet storm. People spoke of her not with pity but with reverence, remembering the light in her smile and the steadiness of her presence. She had walked back into the world that once cast her out, not with anger, not with a demand for retribution, but with dignity so profound it unsettled even those who had once ignored her suffering. The stepmother, who had built her reputation on false charm, found herself increasingly isolated. Every attempt to reclaim admiration sounded hollow, every excuse rang false. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the community turned away from her. Where once she was admired, now she was tolerated. Where once she commanded respect, now she stood exposed as small and bitter in contrast to the woman she had tried to erase. The stepmother's downfall was not sudden, nor was it orchestrated by the woman she had wronged. It came through comparison, through the undeniable difference between cruelty and resilience, bitterness and grace. The woman who had returned needed no words to condemn her. Her very existence was the proof of her triumph. The stepmother faded into irrelevance, her influence crumbling not because of a public scandal but because she could no longer command the illusions she had relied upon. And perhaps that was the truest punishment of all, to be forgotten, while the one she sought to destroy was remembered. For the woman herself, the end of the story was not about vengeance but about peace. She carried the scars of her childhood, yes, but they were no longer open wounds. They were reminders of what she had endured, marks of battles survived rather than symbols of weakness. She understood now that her worth had never depended on her stepmother's approval, nor even on her father's protection. Her worth was her own, forged in resilience, in kindness, in the refusal to be broken. The smile that had shaken everyone else was also her own reminder. She had chosen life, she had chosen strength, she had chosen to rise. Her legacy lived not only in whispers of admiration but in the quiet inspiration she offered to others. Children who had felt unwanted found hope in her story. Women who had endured cruelty found courage in her endurance. Even men, watching the consequences of her father's silence, learned the cost of neglect. Her journey became a lesson, that rejection is not the end, that betrayal does not define you, that survival can bloom into triumph. And though she did not seek to be remembered as a legend, she became one nonetheless. Not because she fought with fists or thunderous words, but because she fought with resilience, because she returned with nothing but a smile, and that smile was enough to change everything.